Stop right there. I know what you're thinking. Swords are polished symbols of honor and knightly heroics, gleaming in sunlight. But the truth is grittier. Swords were often biological time bombs, bone grinders, and status trophies crusted with centuries of muck and human remains. Over the next 17 minutes, you'll meet 15 legendary blades you've probably never heard of. And I'll ruin the fantasy, so you never look at a shiny metal scrap the same way again. You think ancient swords dissolve into rust, but then there's the Goujian, a 2,000-year-old Chinese bronze that looks almost new. Found in a swamp, its blade still sharp and mirror-bright thanks to a mysterious alloy and airtight burial conditions. It whispers that metallurgy used to be a dark art. But the creepy part, microscopic analysis shows ancient oils and organics in the sheath that acted like preservatives, basically embalming the weapon in a greasy time capsule. You think Charlemagne's sword is a single mythic Excalibur moment, but Joyeuse is a messy museum mashup. Coronation claims, multiple candidate blades, and a prestige object worn like a celebrity logo. It was less a battlefield killer and more a mobile shrine. Kings treated the blade like a social media account. The gross reality: these swords were handled by sweaty nobles, kissed by devotees, and probably reeked like an aristocrat. You think El Cid's swords are romantic trophies of honor, but Tizona reads like a murder log. Its edge is pockmarked with repairs and rivets that scream constant resharpening, each nick a human story. Forensics on similar blades reveal hairline fractures cured by brutal ad hoc rivets. These weren't ceremonial relics. They were battlefield handyman jobs kept alive, because a dead hero's weapon was community You assume Colada was just another dashing sword, but this blade doubles as a vote magnet. El Cid's Colada traveled courts as proof of conquest, exchanged like a trophy handbag among nobles. The gross truth is that such swords often had layers of ancient gore baked into the scabbard leather, looked holy to the crowd, and were trotted out to convince people that whoever held the steel held legitimacy, and probably a few fresh. You think Kusanagi is a samurai's prize, but it's more shrine than weapon, a symbol of imperial power with ritual weight. The real sword story is buried in myths about storms, regicide, and political theater. Sometimes the physical blade vanished and a ceremonial stand-in ruled instead. That gap between story and metal allowed rulers to swap out real weapons for replicas, while keeping the supernatural reputation intact. Governance by symbolism, not. If you picture swords as metal, prepare to be wrong and a little queasy. The Macuahuitl was a wooden club edged with thousands of razor obsidian chips, like a medieval lawnmower for humans. It didn't slice like steel. It shredded flesh in ragged, bone-chipping ways that left terrible messes on the battlefield. Spanish accounts describe heads popped like watermelons. It's a reminder that blade doesn't equal polished steel, and gore comes in. You think the Claíomh Solais is pure fairy tale brilliance, but Irish swords of light were political fireworks. Claiming to possess such a weapon was often a claim on kingship itself, a PR stunt dressed as magic. Archaeology reveals many supposed magical blades were ordinary iron or ritual lumps, but their stories made them irresistible. The weapon's myth could blind an entire tribe to the fact it was based. You think all Viking swords were crude, then Ulfberht shows up like a hacker's signature. These blades sometimes used crucible steel with such low impurities that medieval smiths called them witchcraft, or they were clever forgeries copying a brand name. The unsettling truth is that one brand buried an industrial secret in a world of backyard blacksmiths, and control of superior steel could turn a traitor into a warlord. You imagine coronation swords are straight-laced ceremony tools, but Szczerbiec has a bureaucratic cruelty to it. Its name hints at a notch made while striking a gate, a trademark accident turned holy relic. It became an item of state power, passed and faked across centuries as Poland's identity shifted. That notch story is the real horror. A mundane mistake became sacralized, weaponizing accident into political myth that outlived. You think Zulfiqar is just a cool-looking blade, but it's a living emblem of religious power and martial myth. The split tip is more symbolic than practical. It became an instantly recognizable sigil for leaders and movements, and its image circulated more than any single physical sword. The ugly side is that iconography sometimes trumped fact. claiming Zulfiqar's blessing could justify violence, and people died for a picture faster than for an actual. You think the greatest swords hang forever in museums. Honjo Masamune challenges that comfort with an absence that smells like conspiracy. This legendary Masamune blade, famed for craftsmanship and spiritual aura, disappeared after World War II and has never resurfaced. The disappearance turned the sword into a whisper network of rumors, with shady collectors, wartime looters, and the uncomfortable idea that priceless cultural treasures can vanish because people treat them like expensive furniture. You think William Wallace's sword is straightforward national pride, but the Wallace sword is propaganda with spikes. The blade on display is enormous, likely exaggerated to make an already mythic figure seem bigger, literally. Museums have been complicit in stretching sizes and stories because people love giant things. The result is a national icon built on a bootstrapped prop that speaks to how nations manufacture deep, greasy myths for their diners. You think swords must be straight and noble, but the khopesh is a prehistoric design like a sickle attached to doom. It hooked shields, ripped flesh, and often served as a status marker in tombs more than on battlefields. The grotesque irony. Many khopeshes found in graves show no battle damage, suggesting Egyptians prized the idea of the hooked blade far more than its actual utility. A ceremonial grotesque, you picture coronation rituals as solemn and immutable, but Kurtana adds a performative limp. Its tip is intentionally blunted, and legendary stories claim it was broken off in a heroic act. That damaged point became a ritualized mercy, symbolizing forgiveness rather than violence. And yet it's also a reminder of how damage gets reframed into virtue. The unsettling cultural move is turning physical trauma into moral theater, so the state can score. You think dragon-slaying swords are pure fantasy, but Graham represents how myth launders violence into virtue. The saga details a sequence of reforgings, betrayals, and familial murder, meaning the hero's magic sword hides a domestic crime scene. The unsettling truth is that ancient epics used supernatural swords to sanitize revenge. Calling a blade destined equals absolution for a messy personal vendetta that left. You assume metal always decays, but peat bogs are natural embalming closets that preserve blades and bodies like terrible museum exhibits. Anaerobic, acidic conditions stop bacteria and create airtight tombs that freeze artifacts in time. That's why archaeologists find swords with wooden hilts and leather scabbards intact centuries later. And why digging one up feels less like discovery and more like opening an ancient lunchbox where everything smells wrong, but the pattern. You think medieval smiths were artisans with names, but brands like Ulfberht show early intellectual property and counterfeits. A maker's mark became a reputation engine, prompting copycats and fakes that promised miracle performance. The darker truth, reputation created markets where lying about provenance could buy you power, and armies equipped with fakes got slaughtered. Brand hustle isn't new, it just bled. You probably romanticize the scent of antique shops, but old blades carry biological ghosts, dried blood, fatty deposits, and centuries of bacterial stew. Conservators sometimes work under fume hoods because the smell is chemically and morally heavy. Animal fats used for preservation and human oils from hands congeal into a film. It's a sensory reminder that these objects carry bodies' residues, making them literal. You think swords were only for killing, but many were legal tender. Gifts, oaths, and proof of authority in one metal package. Passing a famous blade could transfer titles, settle disputes, or seal betrayals. Possession equaled legitimacy. The ugly fallout is that the sword's symbolic power encouraged theft, forgery, and assassination. If owning a blade made you a ruler, plenty of. You think nicked swords just show wear, but each micro-scratch is a forensic diary entry. What metal it hit, how it was repaired, even whether the wielder used it more on armor or people. Modern microscopy can read these tiny scars and reconstruct battles, revealing that so-called glorious blows were often glancing hacks. The grim lesson: the blade's margins keep a private record of violence that can outlast. You think museums always show originals, but replicas quietly shoulder the weight of national narratives all the time. Whether because originals vanished or were too sacred, institutions install accurate fakes that still function as cultural shorthand. The murky consequence is that people worship an idea rather than an artifact, and removing the real object from public view turns authenticity into a private commodity for collect. You assume guns replaced swords cleanly, but swords outlived early firearms in giving social meaning because they symbolized honor. While muskets shattered and rusted, blades were easier to maintain, parade, and sell as heirlooms. That allowed swords to persist in ceremonial roles, and in many cultures, blades retained symbolic potency even as they became militarily obsolete. A stubborn relic that social structures refused to retire. You might imagine neat decapitations, but the worst injuries were blunt mixes of cutting and crushing. Blades that didn't just slice, but splintered bone and shredded joints. These hybrid wounds caused infection, sepsis, and slow, humiliating deaths when clean surgery wasn't available. Medieval accounts hide this behind heroic phrases, but the archaeological truth is a catalog of infection-driven fatalities and amputations performed without anesthesia. The real nightmare. You think cursed swords are just spooky stories, but curses had practical uses. They deterred thieves, enforced taboos, and inflated value. Wrapping a blade in ritual cloth and saying it's haunted made people think twice, effectively protecting property in chaotic times. The unnerving consequence is how superstition became a legal instrument. Fear of damnation could be weaponized to secure ownership without. You think a sword's purpose is singular, but most blades had dual lives: functional violence and shiny spectacle. Soldiers used and abused them, then officers buffed them for parades and portraits. This duplicity created preservation paradoxes. Too much use ruined value, but too much polishing erased the marks that told the true stories, letting elites control which narrative, blooded tool, or glorious relic would survive. And you assume legends are static, but metallurgists and archaeologists quietly dismantle myths with microscopes and mass spectrometers. They can tell if a blade was forged from imported steel, reheated, or patched, rewriting origin stories that once rested on pure belief. It's thrilling and unsettling. Science can demystify miracle swords, exposing trade routes, looted goods, and forged provenance that topple centuries of curated national. You think missing swords simply vanished into history, but many reappeared in clandestine markets where collectors laundered cultural heritage. Priceless blades can be smuggled, sold, and reintroduced as lesser-known artifacts with fake paperwork. The ugly reality is ethical lines blur when money meets nostalgia, and institutions sometimes turn a blind eye for funding, making cultural patrimony negotiable. You assume only amateurs fall for fakes, but well-made replicas deceive even trained specialists when context is missing. Skillful forgers use period techniques and artificially age blades, then craft convincing provenance stories. That's why museums sometimes display fakes for decades before technology reveals the lie. And why we should always treat artifacts with a mix of awe and healthy skepticism. Rather, you think social media is new, but swords were medieval content engines, trophies, gossip magnets, and headline acts. A captured blade told a whole story: who won, who betrayed, who rose and fell, like viral posts that stick. The terrifying takeaway is that reality became secondary to narrative. Control the sword story, and you controlled history's headline. You assume every sword tale is trustworthy, but a few red flags reveal fabrication. Missing chain of custody, sensational provenance, repeated miraculous claims, and sudden wartime discoveries. Cross-check metallurgy reports, excavation records, and independent scholarship. If the origin smells too neat, grand auctions, private trophies, there's a good chance the story has been polished as much as the blade, and you think swords are tools, but their true magnetism mixes power, sexuality, and mortality into a potent cultural cocktail. They sign contracts, seal marriages, and threaten death in one gleaming gesture. That blend of meanings made them irresistible symbols to leaders, lovers, and grifters, turning metal into mythology and giving ordinary objects the power to control. You often prefer the myth, but the forensic truth can be stranger and messier and more interesting. A blade's scratches reveal trade networks, a missing sword reveals wartime theft, and a priest's blessing reveals social engineering. The mess of evidence beats tidy hero stories because it exposes how humans actually behaved. Messy, strategic, superstitious. You came expecting shining romance but found messy reality. Swords are preserved stories of power, hygiene failures, forgeries, and clever branding. They teach us that what survives is often what people wanted to remember, not what actually happened, and that sometimes a rusted notch is more honest than a legend. If this ruined your appetite and sharpened your curiosity, subscribe for the